My Govan, and welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek. And did you know that the ending of The Lord of the Rings is not actually the original written ending? In fact, Tolkien wrote an epilogue for The Lord of the Rings, which comes after the end as we have it published, but he was convinced not to put it into the story because it basically kind of ruined the ending a little bit in some ways. It's not really explained what exactly Tolkien had in mind or what his critics thought. And by critics, I don't mean people who criticize the published text, obviously, but the people who were reading it before he published it, probably C.S. Lewis and a couple other people. At any rate, you can find this epilogue in the volume Sauron Defeated, which is volume 9 of the History of Middle-earth. This guy, if you can not glare. And it's a really interesting epilogue. In fact, there's two versions of it, and I'll cover both of them. The second one is a little bit different in form, but substantive. In terms of substance, it's not really that different. So let's take a look at these two versions of the epilogue and get some ideas of what Tolkien had in mind. So in the first version of this epilogue, we find that Sam, many years after the end of the story, as we know it in the published version of The Lord of the Rings, has 8 or 9 kids and is reading to them out of the Red Book. And it tells us he's actually just finished going through the entire Red Book, which has taken several months, which makes sense. Some of his kids are kind of young, and you can imagine reading sessions probably aren't that long, and when they are, they're long because kids interrupt. At any rate, he finishes reading this one particular evening, and the kids start peppering him with questions. One of them is particularly interested in the horses of Rohan. Do they have more horses than they used to? But a lot of the questions kind of center around what you might call the more mythical aspects of the story. They want to know about, what are the dwarves and Gimli up to? What's happened to all the elves? What are, different things going on that were connected to the story, but in some ways are kind of connected to the mythical past. And another one of those is Ince, for instance. And Sam, gives him information to the extent that he knows to some of these questions. So he talks about Gimli going and helping Aragorn rebuild Minas Tirith, and then he also says that he visits the Glittering Caves once every year or two, which is interesting because in the appendices of the published Lord of the Rings, he actually becomes the Lord of the Glittering Caves of Aglarond, which it's interesting to see that Tolkien apparently changed his mind in between drafting this epilogue and then when he wrote the appendices. At any rate, in terms of the elves, he also mentions the fact that the elves, many of them have left Middle-earth at the same time that Elrond did with Frodo and Galadriel and others. Celeborn, however, is still in Middle-earth, and many other elves are, but since they haven't left yet, they're probably going to be around for a while longer. But they're becoming, more and more hard to find, and the same basically goes with Ince. He says, ever since Legolas and Gimli made their trip to Fangorn, I haven't heard of anybody seeing Ince. They kind of keep to themselves in their forest. So there's kind of a running theme a little bit in these questions and answers that you get this sense of, the old times of elves and magic and even dwarves to an extent is fading, and the Red Book is going to be kind of the only thing that connects what comes later to these earlier times. And in particular, Eleanor, who is his oldest daughter, and that's Elanor. Note that it's the name of the flower, one of the flowers that they find in Lothlorien when they visit in the main story. She asks if the flower is still, growing in Lothlorien, and Sam says, as far as he knows, it is. And it also just happens to be Eleanor's birthday. At any rate, after all these questions are done, it's time to get ready for dinner, and he says, all right, no more questions. But some of the kids are kind of unhappy about this because they didn't get their questions out before the other kids all kind of spilled theirs. And so to kind of quiet everybody down, what he does is he pulls out this letter that came, and it's written on black paper in silver letters in Elvish and Common speech, and it's a letter from Aragorn, the king. And he never refers to him as Aragorn, he just refers to him as the king, because that's, how everybody knows him at this point. And he opens it and he reads it to the kids, and he basically says, so in a week, Aragorn is going to be visiting. And they're like, he's going to come here? Well, he's not coming here. He's coming to the north, to, his North Kingdom of Arnor, of course. But he does want to meet his friends at the Brandywine Bridge. And this is significant because in the story, and it may have been in the appendices, I don't remember if it was in the main story or the appendices, but it tells us that Aragorn does issue an edict basically saying that no big people are allowed in the Shire. And he follows his own rules, as Sam tells us in this epilogue. So Aragorn is going to be coming to visit, and he says we're going to meet him at the Brandywine Bridge and probably even be invited to his house for a few weeks, which is a really big deal, of course. So this, of course, is really exciting for all of Sam's children. And then after this, he kind of closes off the discussion. They have dinner, and once the kids are to bed, it tells us that he has this conversation with Rosie outside, and he's talking about how a year ago well, no, not a year ago, but, several years ago, it was around the same time that he was with Frodo on Mount Doom, because this is actually the anniversary of the destruction of the ring, roughly. In some of the versions, he has several different versions. There's two main texts, but he made emendations that Christopher Tolkien notes, and he changes the dates around in some of them. It's like he hadn't quite finalized what the date was, but at any rate, it's around the same time that they had been on the slopes of Mount Doom, and he said that, he had almost given up hope of seeing Rosie again, and Rosie says that she didn't hope at all until the day he came back, and it's like before he came back, she just had this feeling that he was going to be back, and she was just really happy and singing and whatnot, and her mother was all like, quiet down, do you want the big people ruffians to come and make trouble for us? But at any rate, Sam returned with the other hobbits, and they took care of the ruffian problem, and no big deal. So at any rate, they have this conversation, and then Sam kind of goes into talking about how, referring back to what Frodo says to him at the end of the story about how he's meant to be one and whole for many years, and he says that now I am whole. Part of him, in a sense, was lost when Frodo went, but now with his family, he thinks of himself as whole. And they're going inside, but as he closes the door, it says that he hears, at least in his mind, the murmur and sigh of the sea on the shores of Middle-earth, which is kind of a premonition of him eventually taking a ship of his own and sailing into the west after Frodo. So it's a kind of an interesting little epilogue, and now let's take a look at the second version. Now, in the second version, Sam is not reading the Red Book to his children, but rather this is already after dinner, and all of them except Eleanor, whose birthday it is, have gone to bed. And he's in his study, and he's looking through some notes that he's taken over time, which is basically his ideas for filling out the last pages of the Red Book, because he hasn't written in those last few pages that Frodo left. And so Eleanor asks him, what are those? And she wants him to talk to him because it's her birthday and she gets to stay up as a special privilege. So he kind of shows her what the notes are, and they kind of cover the same territory, the dwarves, the elves, that sort of thing. Eleanor again asks about the flower, and there's just various things like that. Nothing too different here. It's just not in the format of kids asking him questions on the fly. It's like he's recorded their questions and gathered information such as he could, like from Merry and Pippin and things like that. So they get to discussing all this. Again, Eleanor asks about the flower, and you get some of the same kinds of conversation, but then before she goes to bed, she says, well, before I go to bed, can I see it? And he's like, see what? The letter, of course. And Sam is surprised, but it turns out Eleanor had seen the letter from Aragorn delivered, and so he pulls out the letter and they read it, kind of like they do in the earlier version of the epilogue. And one of the things that I forgot to mention in the previous section about this, and it's true in both, when Aragorn names Sam in the letter, he says that Samwise, who ought to be called Fullwise or Plainwise, depending on which version you're looking at. And what this is a reference to is the fact that Samwise, in kind of an older language, I can't remember if this is based on Old English or not, it's been a while, but the his name basically means half-wise or half-wit, you know, to use an older type of term. And so Sam kind of says, so now you know what the king thinks of your dad. So it's really touching too, because you have to remember too that Sam and Strider, as he was known back then, didn't get off to the best start in their relationship. But of course, Sam is now very close friends with Aragorn, and Frodo is gone, and Sam is really kind of like the last major representative, along with Merry and Pippin, of the Fellowship that Aragorn probably sees on a regular basis. Besides, you know, Legolas and Gimli are still around, but as far as the hobbits go, Sam is probably the main one. Probably Pippin too, because Pippin makes trips to Gondor. But of course, Sam is, you know, gets elected mayor, and so he's kind of a big deal in the Shire as well. So it's really interesting to see how Aragorn, you know, basically praises him for his wisdom, which is interesting too, just in terms of the story, because in the story we do get to see Sam using his common sense a lot, and he usually ends up being right. He's not really a half-wit. So at any rate, he praises him for that, and it's the same kind of deal, except this time Sam also adds the fact that there will probably be many elves at Aragorn's house, including Elladan and Elrohir, the brothers of Arwen. Arwen herself, of course, will probably be there, and many other elves besides. And so, you know, visiting, they'll get to see elves and that sort of thing. So that also is kind of a big deal. And then at the end of the conversation, Eleanor is about to go to bed, and she basically says, well, you know, you should make our conversation here the last pages of the Red Book. And so that's kind of where the epilogue idea comes in, although of course we never got it. But after that, Sam, we see him going outside and talking with Rose again, having basically the same conversation, and again going inside, saying that, you know, he hears the sound of the sea, which is slightly more interesting in this version, because he actually tells Eleanor about the fact that Frodo had mentioned that his time may also come. And significantly, they actually have a brief conversation about this in this second version, because Eleanor tells him, you know, that when you go, I will go too, which tells you how close she is with Sam. But Sam, you know, he could probably come back and basically say, you're not really going to have that option, but instead he takes a softer route, and he basically says, well, few people get that choice, but even the ones that do, you shouldn't choose before the time. Basically kind of telling her, like, even if you get that option, you shouldn't necessarily choose, which of course is an echo of his own predicament, sort of, because he is torn between wanting to go with Frodo and then staying. And you can kind of see him carrying on and giving that same advice in a slightly less direct way to Eleanor, basically like, your place is really here, and you shouldn't choose to follow me before it's even time, let alone rashly. So a really interesting conversation that happens in this piece. But of course it ends pretty much the same way, with that premonition that someday Sam will, of course, end up taking his own boat into the west. So before closing out this video, I did want to show one really quick thing from the actual book. Tolkien wrote out in Elvish the letter. That's actually two different versions of it. They're slightly different in their writing, and it even shows it. Christopher Tolkien reproduces them pretty accurately, to the point that one of them, the print starts out kind of big and then it gets smaller because he has to fit it on a page. But it's really cool that he includes basically a facsimile copy of the text that Tolkien wrote out as the letter. So that's pretty neat. So that's pretty much the epilogue that we didn't get, but you can get in Sauron Defeated. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope that was an interesting little extra tidbit for the end of The Lord of the Rings. It's a really fascinating extra end to the story. You can kind of see why it wouldn't work as an added on section, because it's just the way the story ends in its published form is just so perfect. But at any rate, if you did enjoy the video, please give it a like and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, where I throw in some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can subscribe to my channel here, and you can support the channel here, and you can find two of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.